Very pleased to see so many participants in today's meeting. Also pleased, I must admit, to see well-known faces, including former colleagues. Welcome to you all, and looking forward to seeing you hopefully soon again face to face. But today, this meeting is again a virtual meeting to discuss investment facilitation for development. At the International Trade Center, we co-host this meeting. We are very proud to do so because as an agency working towards development, this topic is by definition very important for us. And it is a topic that is very important for our main stakeholders at the International Trade Centers, small and medium-sized enterprises. The importance of the topic investment is such that we published last year a report, our annual report, the SME Competitiveness Outlook, under the topic Big Money for Small Firms. And we chose that topic on purpose, that title on purpose, because we wanted to show the big difference between big finance, global finance, big money, and our stakeholders, enterprises, but small ones. And even in times before the crisis, before the COVID-19 crisis, where money was floating around, that money, at least that was what we were being told, a lot of liquidity in the markets, that money was not necessarily reaching our clients. So we, in that report, we try to assess what needs to be done in order for the big money to find the small businesses, because many of these small businesses have very relevant and profitable business ideas that could be very useful for the development of their countries. That was before the crisis, before COVID-19. Right now, I think it's hard for us even to imagine what doing business looks like in micro, small, and even medium-sized enterprises in much of the developing world, where a lockdown means that no business happens and that no income arrives, because not everywhere do enterprises have the advantage that enterprises in countries like Switzerland have, that the government intervenes and assists to maintain the cash flows and to maintain payments to workers. Access to finance is a bigger problem than ever for small and medium-sized enterprises, and access to finance will be an important issue for the way out of the crisis into what we are now, many of us are calling the new normal. After having told you why ITC is interested in this topic, allow me to add a personal note why I'm very interested in this topic. I am a trade economist and have spent most of my time in agencies, of my professional time in agencies working on trade. But I studied with a lot of people who are currently working in big accounting firms or in big consultancy companies. And I know that for the past 2 decades, they have been advising their clients on how to trade, where to invest in order to maximize profits. And not only did they take trade and investment decisions together, they were also looking at taxation systems at the same time. When I tell those friends that in the trade community, we are still asking ourselves whether we are allowed to look at trade and investment together, those friends laugh at me. Now, I'm already a bit advanced in my career. I still have a bit to go, but not another 2 or 3 decades. I would like to end my career not being the laughing stock of the people I studied with. And I would like us to find a way to look at these important aspects that businesses do look at together. I would like us to understand how we can do this at the policy level, and in our context, how we can do this at the international policy level. That's the topic today. How can an institution like the WTO tackle a theme like investment facilitation? The term facilitation helps us because the WTO already has a trade facilitation agreement. So that makes communication around these 2 terms easy. But the WTO also already deals with investment under the GATS agreement, but only with investment related to services. I assume an investment facilitation agreement would go further than this. So when you are an institution and members are discussing investment facilitation in an institution like the WTO, they will have to take the existing legal framework and the existing institutional setups into account. They may wish to change them, but these are decisions that have to be taken, but they have to take into account the status quo. These are the type of issues we will discuss today. What would it practically imply to integrate investment facilitation, discussion, negotiation, rules, provisions into a multilateral framework that is already existing at the WTO? And I look very much forward to listen to the contributions from our panelists today. I've been told that Axel will introduce the panelists, and that would be a very good idea because I may become too nostalgic when I start pronouncing the names of some of them. Sherry, Rodolph, others, please. I look forward to the discussion, and I look forward to listening to you. Thanks. Over to Axel.
Thank you very much, Marion, for your introductory remarks. And as you rightly said, today we are going to discuss the relationship between an international framework for investment facilitation and the WTO system and the WTO rulebook. So basically, this is a discussion about coherence. This is a discussion about effective multilateral rules. And so I'm also very much looking forward to this discussion. So we will today discuss how can a potential future international framework for investment facilitation for development be integrated into the WTO. Obviously, it's still too early to say whether this will be a multilateral agreement or a plurilateral agreement, but it's important to discuss these issues early on and also to really get a sense of what the implications of each of the alternatives are. So when we discuss the relationship between a potential investment facilitation agreement and the existing WTO agreements, we often focus on the TFA, the trade facilitation agreements, and we've done that in previous webinars because both agreements have a focus on facilitation. But obviously, as you also mentioned, Marion, there are other agreements in the WTO system and WTO rulebook, like the GATS, which is of high relevance because 60% of global investments are services. Furthermore, there are other plurilateral initiatives focusing on, for example, domestic regulation of services that have many overlaps with the investment facilitation negotiations. So our discussion today will be forward-looking. We will discuss very systemic questions, but it's still important to address them while negotiations are in an early phase, as they can and probably should have an impact on the substance of a future agreement. So to ensure system-wide coherence of rules and institutional arrangements in the WTO, which obviously has also something to do with making the WTO more effective and modernize the rules of the WTO in light of the interlinkages between trade and investment, global value chains, as Marion rightly said. I'm very, very pleased that we have, again, an excellent panel today. And let me introduce the panelists very briefly. You have their bios in the invitation that we've sent a couple of days ago. First of all, we have Ambassador Matthias Franke from Chile. He's the coordinator of the structured discussions on investment facilitation for development. And so he will brief us on the state of play in the negotiations. And then we have Rolf Adlung. He has been a long-time counselor in the Trade and Services Division of the WTO. Today, he's an independent trade policy analyst and one of the key experts on the GATS, on services trade. And then also Sherry Stevenson is a well-known expert on services trade. Sherry is a member of the PECC Services Network and also an independent consultant. And Sherry will look at the relationship between the investment facilitation negotiations and the domestic regulation services discussions. Let me stop here with my introductory remarks, but one thing I'd like to highlight, this should be an interactive discussion. So you're more than happy to join the discussion. If you have questions, if you have comments, please submit them in the comment box of the Zoom window. I will keep a look at the questions and comments and introduce them to the panelists. One last word, this webinar will also be streamed live on YouTube. So in case you experience any technical problems with Zoom, you can just switch to YouTube and continue watching our debate. With this being said, I'd like to hand over to Ambassador Franke and ask him to briefly introduce the state of play in the structured discussions, including, to the extent possible, the way forward of the negotiations. And Ambassador Franke, please also feel free to provide some substantive remarks on the key issues being discussed in this webinar. Over to you, Ambassador Franke.
Good morning, greetings from Santiago, Chile. This sounds like a very German-speaking webinar, no? Marion, good morning. Axel, also good morning. Thank you much for inviting me to participate and give me the chance to update you on the latest development on the IFD initiative. Our last meeting, when the work methodology and calendar was agreed, took place 3 months ago already. And since then, although participating members have been active in presenting proposals and contributions, we hadn't been able to meet again face-to-face. Last week, we sent an invitation to 3 virtual meetings that will take place between next week and early July. And this invitation was sent to all WTO members because, as you know, it has always been our goal to have open and transparent discussions and not limited only to the 100 and so participating members on the initiative. These 3 virtual meetings will allow delegations to share information and resume thematic discussion, but will not serve the purpose of conducting negotiation. So therefore, will not lead to decision taking or drafting suggestion by the coordinator. The first meeting will take place a week from tomorrow, so the 5th of June. And Argentina, China, the EU, Japan, Qatar, and Turkey will have the chance, if they wish to do so, to present their written proposal, the written contributions, and the paper they've been submitting in the last weeks. In addition, I will present the informal consolidated text that we circulated in April. And this presentation will be followed by an element-by-element discussion. So based on the thematic structure of the informal consolidated text. We're looking forward to interactive debate, including question and answers on the consolidated text, the proposal and contributions, and this element-by-element discussion will continue at the following meetings. As I said, the next one will be at the end of June, and the third one will be at the beginning of July. In parallel, members, we are encouraging members to conduct informal, bilateral, and small group consultations on the proposals that they see appropriate. So that's the way forward. That's the most feasible way, and I think the most appropriate way, and we hope the more productive way to continue with the discussions under this initiative. And hoping to have the possibility to meet again face-to-face and conduct a real conversation already on the negotiating mode. And of course, for me also to be able to go back to Geneva and chair and coordinate those meetings in person. Now, as you said, Axel, as I mentioned you in the internal conversations before this webinar, I also would like to touch upon the issues to being discussed today in this webinar, and give you some personal notes. Of course, these are my personal notes, not a coordinator. Because the 3 questions that are raised are really highly relevant and of a systemic nature. So any response or any debate that we will have during the webinar or in the future may have effects beyond the scope of the FID initiative. So any new initiative, sort of whether plurilateral or multilateral, will look into what we are doing here in the IFD initiative. I understand some of these issues were briefly discussed before my time in the early phases of the debate, and hence the 3 questions are very pertinent, and I hope they will trigger a useful exchange of ideas today and in the future. On how to integrate a future framework on IFD into W architecture, let's keep in mind that this initiative that aims and has always been aiming to develop a framework that is multilateral. And that should be our target. And the WTO agreement provides space for new multilateral agreements. And this is the case of the trade facilitation agreement already mentioned by Mario. Nevertheless, we also must think about alternatives in case we don't reach that ultimate goal, the ambitious objective and goal of embarking all WTO members. For such a scenario, the Marrakesh Agreement also provides options. And I suggest members to start thinking about what they want in terms of the legal architecture and how they want it. In that assessment, most probably the systemic implication that I was mentioning before, that any of these alternatives may have in future initiatives and agreements, should have a special consideration in those assessments. Regarding the second question, the interrelation between the future investment facilitation for development on one side and the WTO agreement, including the GATS and the domestic regulation disciplines on the other, it is crucial to avoid any inconsistency between these legal frameworks. Until now, I haven't seen any discrepancy, but since the text of a future framework is still work in progress, this is something that we all need to keep in the back of our minds. In relation to overlaps, I don't think there will be any problem, if there are any, as long as there is no contradiction between the instruments. Actually, it may be unavoidable to have some degree of overlap because these frameworks that don't have the same exact scope. For example, the GATS doesn't apply to investment in non-services sector. So last but not least, in this context, I will highlight the increasing momentum that the initiative has gained over the last month. Morocco recently joined. We have reached 101 participants. And this expanding support serves as a clear evidence of the importance of the majority of WTO members attached to the investment facilitation for development. So we are looking forward to beginning working with all IFD participants and WTO members in general in this new phase of the process starting next week, and encourage you all to come prepared for a dynamic and interactive discussion starting on the 5th of June. So thank you very much and good luck today. Back to you, Axel.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for your introductory remarks. I'm looking at the Zoom chat box, and there's a question whether the text is available or whether it's still confidential. Maybe you can say a couple of words on that, because obviously that's something many observers of these discussions are concerned with.
For the time being, the text is restricted to only to WTO or to WTO members, and including the participants. So it's again in the aim of having open and transparent discussion. It has been circulated to all WTO members, not only the participants. It's not open to public. It's structured in the way that we have been members or participants have been talking about the initiative. If you give me 1 second, I could open the document. Give me 1 second, and I could give you at least the structure of the document. My computer is slow, but give me 1 second. And I don't think my colleagues at the Secretariat or at the mission will be killing me after saying this. I hope. I ask for the indulgence. Give me 1 second. Where are you? 2020 IFD. The idea, the text is based on different sections. We're talking about the consolidated text, the formal consolidated text that we circulated in April. So we're talking about in one section about transparency of investment measures. Another section we're talking about streamlining and speeding up administrative procedures and requirements. We're talking about transfers and subrogation, temporary entry of investment person, facilitation of movement of business person, scope and general principle, of course. Another section we're talking about contact focal point ombudsman type of mechanism arrangement to enhance domestic coordination and cross-border cooperation and investment facilitation, special differential treatment for developing and least developed country. Of course, it's a very important section, is an important element of the architecture of the consolidated text. The name of the initiative says investment facilitation for development, so special differential treatment for developing and least developed country members. And it's not any secret, that the section, I think section 5 on SND is structured in a very similar way to, at least the initial discussion, we're structured in a very similar way to the trade facilitation agreement. And now, again, as I said before, this is work in progress, and we will see more and more proposals. And through the discussion, we will see how the SND provisions will evolve. We have a section on institutional arrangement of final provisions, of course, as any of these kind of frameworks. So meaning how we put this the institutional elements into the global institutional architecture of WTO. So WTO commitment, for example, investment facilitation is something that we're discussing. Financial exceptions, general exceptions, security exceptions, dispute settlement, of course. And finally, there's a section on cross-cutting issues, very interesting, and I think we discussed those cross-cutting issues in the last webinar. So we're talking about corporate social responsibilities, measures against corruption. I think that those are very interesting, and as I said, it was discussed in the last webinar. So I think that gives you some idea of how the consolidated text is structured and how we are going to structure also the discussion. Each of these sections has different elements, 5, 4, 6 elements. So we're going to go element by element within the section, with the proponent, within the participants who are presented written contributions and proposals. So that's it. Thank you, Axel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthias, for giving this overview of what these negotiations are about. To the participants, if you would like to get a sense of what some of the countries have proposed, some of the proposals are online, if I understand. For example, the very detailed proposal by the European Union on investment facilitation, so you can find this easily online, and to get a sense of what is being discussed and what is being proposed. So thanks very much, Matthias, again for this introduction, for your overview. Let's now turn to Rudolf Adlo. I would like to ask you, Rudolf, to talk about what the potential overlaps are, or maybe also inconsistencies between the international framework on investment facilitation for development as it's being discussed at the moment, and existing WTO agreements. And I think we are talking here in particular about the GATS. If you also can talk a little bit about ways on how to integrate an international framework for investment facilitation for development into the WTO rulebook. So what are the alternatives and options? Over to you, Rudolf.
Thank you very much, Axel. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
Fine. Let me start with one of the last observations, special and differential treatment. And I'm a bit concerned that we take too much here, possibly from concepts that we know from in merchandise trade. Special and differential treatment in the GATS, as I understand it, functions in a slightly different way. It functions by way of LDCs and developing countries undertaking less sector commitments and therefore triggering less conditional obligations that are related to the existence of commitments. So for example, I have here the figures about developed countries have committed about 70% of the sectors out of the services universe, least developed countries about 22% of the sectors. And once these commitments are in there, they mean what they mean, what's implied in there and disclosed in the schedule of commitments, but they also trigger background conditional obligations. And these conditional obligations remain essentially the same across all members. And now I see, if I look, for example, in the text now, in the consolidated text, that the conditional obligations to a certain extent disappear because they are made subject to to self-selection provisions of the countries concerned. So that means the draft falls below what already exists in the GATS in terms of the self-designation mechanism, which extends to provisions that are already in force in the GATS. And there are other elements, since I'm speaking about GATS minus, that are also GATS minus, that, for example, the provisions on notification requirements, the provisions on establishing inquiry points are less than what currently exists in the GATS already. And I think that it would be normally inconceivable. On the other side, I feel there are elements, if I were to think as an economist about investment facilitation, that are missing from the draft. For example, national treatment does not show up at all. And I could imagine that national treatment, at least post-establishment, is an important factor that could trigger favorable investment decisions in favor of a certain countries, that the investor is at least confident that he's treated on a par with his domestic competitors. There is nothing also in the draft on subsidy disciplines. And that again is possibly a very important factor at present or later in the problems we currently see to avoid a subsidy race for investment. But there's nothing on there. There is nothing also on competition disciplines. There are provisions on fighting corruptions, but there are no provisions on fighting market rigging practices or disciplining state-owned enterprises. And there is nothing also about regulatory substance. That means it's about transparency provisions, it's about the processes, administrative processes, it's about fees and charges, it's about institutional provisions, but there is nothing that would come close to what is in the negotiating mandate, for example, of Article 6.4 of the GATS. So there I would see quite a number of problems. The other problem Axel was referring to now is how to create a consistent framework that covers not only services, where we do have these challenges, but extends to, here are slides that I had provided before. Are we still there? That's the second part. Possibly we can shift to the second slide. What could be the content of a possible structure that covers goods and services? There could be some common framework provisions, but now it's getting difficult because we don't have a common framework for GATT and GATS. So one possibility would be to rely mostly on the GATS and integrate an improved GATS commitment into and improve GATS obligations into a common framework. That would be the option A, or the option B would be to reinvent everything from scratch. But what would then be the relationship with existing GATS commitments? The question again would then be also, do we need to go for a consistent common framework, or should we leave, or the members leave the door open for a plurilateral agreement that possibly goes along option A because it would be safe as far as the services part is concerned, and would raise the questions of consistency and integration with regard to the merchandise part rather than... Is there a problem with the voice?
Please continue, Rudolf.
The question into the integration into the open rulebook, it's more challenging than certainly in the trade facilitation case, because we are in two different sets of agreements. In trade facilitation, we remain within the annex to the GATT. Now in investment facilitation, we would be on both sides, on the GATT part and on the GATS parts. And it's a different challenge. And the question also in that context is, and here I'm a bit lost, I have to admit honestly, how can that be dealt with? Because it's not only about negotiating the content of something within an existing structure, as would be the case for the trade facilitation agreement or for something confined to services, but we would need, or negotiators would need to go for a united concept across two different structures. And that possibly is the real challenge here. If we were only within the framework of the GATT or within the framework of the GATS, it would be far more easy than here now to address that with the legs on both sides. The other question that occurred to me in reading through some of the background material, and here I would possibly refer back to Ambassador Franke, the Nairobi Ministerial Declaration concludes with the sentence, the WTO, any decision to launch negotiations multilaterally on such issues, and I mean issues not covered by the Doha Development Agenda, on such issues would need to be agreed by all members. Is that still relevant, that provision? If so, then possibly it would be extremely difficult to go for a multilateral negotiation if that requires the agreement of all members who could refer back to the Nairobi Declaration. Possibly I should be ending here because we are running short of time.
Thank you very much, Rudolf, for providing this overview and to really highlight that that it's really important to also have a look at what is already existing in the WTO rulebooks, in particular with regard to the GATS commitments, and not to fall back and not to negotiate on a level that is below what is already existing in the GATS agreement. And now let me turn to Sherry Stevenson and ask her, what are the interrelations between the negotiations on investment facilitation for development and the domestic regulation disciplines? As I said, these are two plurilateral initiatives that have been launched at the last ministerial conference of the WTO in Buenos Aires in 2017. Which are going on in parallel. So Sherry, what are the interrelations? What are the similarities, overlaps potentially? Over to you, Sherry.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you to the German Development Institute and the International Trade Center for the invitation to speak. I'm delighted to see so many friends and previous colleagues, too many to mention, but Marian, Rolf, Axel, Carl, among others. It's great. This is a challenge in a short period of time to address this topic, but I'm going to simplify and we can discuss. Just to start off, to say that the regulatory environment and the discussion of regulations is so important because it influences all business and investment decisions and the competitiveness of the entire economy. So we really have to try to get it as right as possible. And that's the purpose of the ongoing two plurilateral negotiations or discussions right now for an investment facilitation framework and domestic regulation disciplines on services. The IFF discussions or IFD discussions have recently begun, but the work on domestic regulation for services has been ongoing for 2 decades. So just a teeny bit of background. In the WTO context, domestic regulations for services are considered to be measures that are non-discriminatory, not covered by GATS articles on market access and national treatment, but which can have an impact on services trade. But keep in mind from the outset that a subset of the work on services regulations has always included a part of investment. And that part is FDI in services, which is defined in the GATS as commercial presence or mode 3 of services trade. One of the original GATS articles covers domestic regulation, Article 6. But it is not very detailed. Some disciplines are of horizontal applications, not very detailed, and it contains an outstanding mandate to negotiate horizontal disciplines on qualification and licensing procedures and requirements and technical standards. This was left to be completed after the WTO came into force. Since then, there's been a long history of 20 years of work, but the mandate to develop horizontal disciplines has not yet been achieved. It came close at MC11, but was ultimately not successful. In light of this, a subset of WTO members undertook an effort to achieve disciplines on domestic regulation for services through the plurilateral undertaking that we know. Last year, this plurilateral effort resulted in a draft reference paper. The reference paper concentrates mainly on procedural issues, for the authorization of licensing, qualification, and technical standards, not yet, Mohammed, to supply a service, and not on substantive requirements such as the equivalency of qualifications and licensing for professional service providers. There seems to be quite a bit of flexibility for regulators in the draft text, which was inspired by the APEC non-binding principles for domestic regulation of services adopted in 2019. Several provisions contain language that is more elastic, such as to the extent practicable, or endeavor to carry out, or taking into account competing priorities and resource constraints. So in this context, this is a background. I want to make 4 points trying to put the two together, the two initiatives together. First point, and I have 2 slides that support these. The first point is that many of the participants in these 2 plurilateral initiatives are the same, but not all. And this is clear from the fact that almost double the number of economies participate in the investment facilitation discussions for development as participate in the services domestic regulation negotiations. And I have to state that though I am not privy to the meetings nor to the text, it does not seem that to date there has been interaction or coordination between the 2 groups of plurilateral participants and no joint meetings. However, point 2, the objectives for these 2 plurilateral initiatives are very similar. Both wish to elaborate disciplines that will help to make the investment process on one hand and the measures that affect services trade on the other hand more transparent, streamlined, and predictable. Point 3, and now we can put up the slide. Thank you, Mohammed. The large majority of issues discussed in these initiatives cover similar topics. And here you can see a sample of these. There are 10 different areas or topics which are being considered both in the discussions on investment facilitation and in the discussions or in the reference paper on, I believe, on domestic disciplines for domestic regulation in services. So you can see that all of these are common to the discussion in both areas. However, as the note says, it's not clear whether the language being proposed for the same issue is coherent and compatible in both instances. There may be situations where the 2 draft texts contain contradictory or incompatible elements. For example, time frames for the consideration of applications for investment approval that differ from the time frames for the application of licensing approval in the services draft text, or the establishment of 2 different sets of inquiry points that may be asked to cover the same measures at the national level and thus do redundant work, or 2 different mechanisms for implementation of similar measures. Which leads me to the 4th and really important point, and we can go to the next slide. There is an overlap of scope, as I mentioned, in what is being covered under the 2 initiatives, since both of them are developing disciplines that will affect FDI in services, foreign direct investment in services. This is a commercially very significant point. Foreign direct investment in services constitutes around 60% of services trade, as it is statistically measured, and nearly 2/3 of all new foreign direct investment is destined to services activities. So we're talking about a very important subset, which is overlapping in each case with the other area. For all these reasons, we need to ensure coherence between these 2 plurilateral initiatives before the draft texts are finalized, to make sure that the texts don't just espouse similar objectives, but they also develop consistent and compatible wording and procedures. My understanding is that both plurilateral initiatives intend to present substantive outcomes at the coming MC12 in Kazakhstan. And if this has not already been done, it would be very valuable for participants in both areas to ensure that their efforts are aligned and mutually supportive. This will make it more likely that objectives in domestic regulation for services that are being developed and that disciplines or the text of the investment facilitation for development agreement are both realized. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sherry, for your very interesting discussion. I have a couple of questions with regard to the how. I mean, Rudolf and Sherry, you mentioned a couple of challenges with regard to the coherence between the discussions on investment facilitation and existing agreements or other plurilateral discussions. So I'm interested in the how. But looking at the, so let's discuss it in a minute. But looking at the comments and the discussion in the chat box, I think we should take a step back and ask ourselves why should we integrate investment disciplines, investment facilitation disciplines in the WTO? So there was a discussion in the chat box. So would be interesting to have your views why we should include investment facilitation disciplines in the WTO rulebook or system in the first place. So I don't know, Matthias, Rudolf, Sherry, who would like to answer that important question?
I can take a stab at it, or Rolf, do you want to?
Sherry, why don't you start?
All right. Well, I would say that the first and foremost reason is because we really, in our world of integrated economic activities, transactions, production, and trade, we're not able to separate the world in silos as we used to. This is trade in goods, this is trade in services, this is investment. As Marion mentioned in the very beginning, what her colleagues are doing in the practical world of business and consulting is looking at all of these issues together in a coherent whole. Investors don't say, oh, I'm going to choose this spot to trade and this locality to invest and this locality to put up a services firm. They don't do that. We have an integrated context and more between investment, services, goods production. We have global value chains, we're in supply chains where all of these decisions and outcomes are integrated together. And we need a coherent multilateral framework that addresses all of them because they cannot be separated. They are not separated in the real world. They go together. They go together in productive decisions. They go together in trading decisions. And firms need the assurance that there will be rules, there will be disciplines that affect all aspects of their of the way that they produce and invest and trade across the board. Otherwise, we have gaps in our system, we have holes, and that brings a lack of consistency and that brings a lack of predictability. So it is extremely important to make up the gap that currently exists in the WTO system with respect to investment.
Rudolf, would you like to come in?
Just if I may add 2 or 3 observations. I think an indication of the importance also of this link across sectors are the recent regional trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, which normally have one section, one chapter on investment, regardless of the sector. So it applies across the border, across goods and services. The problem, again, possibly compared to the current discussion, is that these investment chapters are essentially BITs, the content. It's not so much about what we are currently or what's currently being discussed in the IFF framework. So it's about, it includes intellectual property rights. It includes, of course, market access provisions and so on. But the indication already is that they felt the participants in these agreements, they need to go across the artificial sectoral borders. To give also a practical example, for example, manufacturing on a fee or contract basis is a service. There are 26 members have undertaken commitments on manufacturing on a fee or contract basis, but it's exactly the same process. It's exactly the same involvement, the same techniques as a normal manufacturing operation, only with the difference that on a fee or contract basis means that the ownership status is different of the inputs and the outputs. So it's so artificial, and there is therefore a strong argument to go across the border. The question, or main question in that context, is whether this IFF discussion really contributes to that, given also the restrictions in the discussion. So the possibly different definitions of investment, the different concept, so the exclusion of market access issues and so forth.
Thank you very much, Rudolf. What I always find interesting is that it's particular developing countries, big and small, which are driving this initiative. So to include investment facilitation provisions into the WTO system. So may I ask Matthias, you're in close touch, obviously, with the negotiators. Why are developing countries supporting this initiative?
Sorry, I had some technical problems to unmute the computer, the iPad. Yes, I mean the substantive responses were given there by Marion and Rudolf. No, global value change, global phenomenon, trade and investment are part of the same equation. The point, as you are saying, why in the WTO? And why WTO? Because I think WTO provides not only the architecture, provides not only the framework to discussions, but also will ensure certain harmonization and standardization of disciplines. So everybody will be abide by the same disciplines, by the same provisions. Again, as I said, we are aiming for multilateral, but at least for those participants for the time being, we are all of us will be bound by the same disciplines, and whatever those disciplines are. And second, and this is to your point, WTO provides the institutional framework and the experience and the capacity to provide technical assistance and capacity building for developing countries. As I mentioned before, S&D provisions will be a very important key factor of the future framework, as it is in the trade facilitation agreement. So in that sense, anchoring in the WTO architecture gives this also this second guarantee. The first one guarantee is the harmonization, the standardization of discipline, and the second is the experience of WTO, and you have many of those experience in this webinar, not myself, of course, to provide that technical capacity and technical assistance and capacity building for those developing countries and least developed countries who will need to implement the outcome or whatever is agreed at the end of the day in this framework. So WTO is a key part of this initiative.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Now let us turn to the key question, at least a key question from my perspective. I mean, Rudolf and Sherry, you highlighted a couple of challenges to really integrate an investment facilitation agreement into the WTO system, so that there's a need to have more coherence, to avoid contradictions, and so on. Obviously, the question I have is how can we make this initiative more compatible with other ongoing initiatives, but also obviously the existing rules in the WTO system. So Rudolf, Sherry, could you maybe provide a couple of ideas on the how to do this, how to create more coherence?
Can I?
Sherry, please.
Sure. Let me just address the area I know best first, which is services, and say that the way I didn't address this, but my understanding is that the participants that have reached the reference paper on disciplines in domestic regulation of services, the intention, once finalized, is to allow WTO members to incorporate it into their schedules of services commitments in the additional commitment column, as was done in the past with the telecommunications reference paper. The idea being then that it would be applied on an MFN basis, but the actual choice to incorporate it or not would be voluntary. Now, that is one way of dealing with a plurilateral effort, which is not multilateralized de facto from the outset. And So I just wanted to put that on the table. Then maybe Ralph can carry on.
Just to add to that, it's a plurilateral effort insofar as not everybody is committed within that context, but the benefits are extended on an MFN basis.
Correct.
So the telecom reference paper is the foremost example. The real challenge in our context now with investment facilitation, from my point of view, is really that we are crossing borders, institutional borders between trading goods and the particular structure of that agreement and trading for services with the particular structure of the GATS. That means extending to 4 modes of supply, including commercial presence, and providing the scope for these additional commitments that could at present be easily used as a framework to move ahead with an investment facilitation regime in services. Now, how to organize that across the border, so to speak? Now, as I mentioned already, there are the 2 options: that one keeps, that one improves in the services context and at the same time does something on merchandise trade, or that one goes for a completely new structure, the new definitions of, for example, of subsidies and so on, because we cannot simply extend that across the 2 regimes. And to be honest, I'm not so sure what option should be in the end the prevailing option. Also, it would be extremely challenging to negotiate a common regime across these 2, across the border. It's not comparable to the TFA, for example. It's not comparable to the negotiations on the additional commitments in telecommunications, because all of a sudden we would try to bring 2 worlds together. And I think that would still require a lot of consideration, reflection on how to proceed. I'm currently struggling with the text on that, but it's a real challenge. And I would be grateful also for inspiration. It's a difficult issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what this discussion shows that it's really not a simple replication of the trade facilitation agreement, what we are talking about here. We are really talking about a very complex substance of how to integrate a new set of rules into an existing system. And so maybe looking at the time, we already have 4 o'clock, but maybe we can spend another 5 minutes because we started a little bit late. I would be interested in what are your suggestions in order, in terms of how to negotiate, in order to how to bring these different discussions together. Sherry referred to or said that there were no discussions between the different negotiation groups. So would that be an idea to bring together the different negotiators that are negotiating, for example, on domestic regulation and investment facilitation? How could this be structured? Sherry or Rudolf or Matthias, also please feel free to come in. Sherry, yeah,
sure.
Now you're unmuted.
Thank you. I'll try first because I'm less close to Geneva, so I'll let those that are close and in Geneva go, that have more inside knowledge, go after me. But I think just to follow up on what we were saying earlier and what Ralph was saying, which is that the difficulty of bringing, from my perspective, bringing in an agreement on investment facilitation with disciplines would depend exactly what those provisions contain. If the provisions are primarily procedural, and if those procedures don't exist to the same degree in WTO text, then it might be easier. Given that there are not market access and national treatment provisions in the proposed investment facilitation framework at the time being, that should make it infinitely easier. So I think in order to answer that question, you can really only answer it by looking at what the proposed provisions in the investment facilitation text actually cover, and how, if they are primarily procedural, plus a huge development component, which is very important, which I don't think would contradict anything that exists in the WTO currently, then one, that would probably be the way to look at it. But of course, lawyers can do this much better. And in terms of how do they cooperate? Well, I suspect the easiest thing would be initially to ask the two chairs to coordinate and exchange information. That's normally how it happens first. And then after that, when they feel appropriate, to invite a joint discussion of any relevant and overlapping provisions.
Thank you very much. Rudolf or Matthias, would you like to come into this discussion as well?
Thank you, Axel. I mean, from my point of view, as a coordinator, it's not too much what I can say. No, it's a matter for. I mean, the coordination. We have to take this question in mind, and we have to always have that in the back of our mind. But also, participating members should have these elements in consideration. What the GATT says and domestic relations says, to ensure that there is no inconsistency when we are negotiating or discussing the IFD initiative. That's on the point of substance. No? There's an additional point that I mentioned and will be discussed most probably at the political level or lawyers. No? How do you put this? Saving all the substantive discussion and the inconsistency or incompatibility, overlapping between the legal frameworks. How do you put the new agreement or the outcome of this process into the WTO rulebook? No, multilateral, plurilateral, the different way. Are we going to use what the WTO agreement say, the Marrakesh agreement? Are we going to go to another different way? As I said in my introduction remarks, no, that's a systemic issue, and the outcome of that, the decision to go one way or another, will have implications for other initiative process currently being discussed and future processes. So these are two different discussions that in some way go a little bit beyond what we are talking at the IF, the Investment Facilitation Initiative. How to anchor this into the rule book, it's one question that we need to face in some moment. We have to tackle that question. And the substantive question that the panelists have been talking about, that is something probably more for the participants in the initiative to consider and have always that in mind in order to avoid this inconsistency and to reduce the overlap, because overlap will happen anyway, but we need to reduce it. So that's probably a role more for the participant than for the coordinator to look into that. I may be wrong. It's still work in process.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthias. Rudolf.
Of course, we could think something that remains very light. So focusing on procedures, for example, on fees and charges to be raised on single window approaches and so on. But also by the same token, that means it would be possibly a best endeavors sort of agreement. How should it be enforced? But it might be a useful minimum outcome, at least, to have some common standards of treatment of investment applications, how to treat it in the process and so on. And then countries may refer to that also if they conclude PTAs or so, where it could be made possibly enforceable. But that would be one, possibly a third option that would or could be kept in mind, to go for something light, procedural, to encouraging compliance with certain principles.
Thank you very much. We have to wrap up here. We already are over our 60-minute limit. This discussion was very, very interesting. It showed me and hopefully also you that this is a very, very complex discussion, and we've been focusing very much in our past discussions on what are the concrete measures that should be included in an international investment facilitation agreement that support development, that support sustainable development. Obviously, these are very, very crucial discussions, but at the same time, we should also keep in mind the systemic implications and interrelations between the investment facilitation discussions and other ongoing discussions and agreements. So, and as Ambassador Franke said, this should also always be on the mind of the negotiators. And my feeling is this is a discussion which is just starting as the negotiations and discussions on concrete measures are just starting. But this is definitely something we should keep on our mind. So this was a kickoff for a discussion, so to say, but I have the feeling this is a very, very crucial and important discussion as well, focusing on the systemic implications and how to integrate a framework on investment facilitation into the WTO. With this, I stop, and Marion, the floor is yours for the wrap up and the conclusion.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion. I'm a bit concerned about one of the things Axel said. This is only the start. Some of these things, as Sherry said, we have been discussing for 20 years. I have been in this career for 20 years. I don't have 20 years to go. So if you're only starting, please move quickly, because I do think it is necessary. We have heard questions like, why the WTO? Well, when you want to merge things or themes or institutions, you have to make pragmatic choices. Our members have made those choices. Ministries have been merged, trade and investment put together. Institutions, trade and investment promotion agencies put together. We have to make these choices. Let's be pragmatic and go for feasible options. Will we have to transgress borders between different agreements? Yes, we will have to, and that's part of our business. We also have to do this when we build data platforms. We have to put different platforms together. We will have to look into the nitty-gritty, but we never should forget what we really want to achieve, which is trade and investment for development. If we don't manage to transgress and build the nitty-gritty together, an alternative is to throw everything away and start from scratch. That's normally costly. We don't like to do that, for instance, in data frameworks, but keep in mind that there may be players who may have that kind of option in mind. I would like to stop with the last point. Several of you have mentioned the need to ensure coherence, to avoid gaps, to avoid contradictions. And I believe there is an important reason why we want to close these gaps and avoid contradictions. Large companies, large players can play around these contradictions and incoherences for their advantage. Small players, and that includes the small and medium-sized enterprises we work for at the International Trade Center, cannot play these games. They simply do not have the resources for it. They would like one simple, harmonized rule book. And I urge all of you who are interested and engaged in this debate to work together towards the creation of a harmonized system that also small players can take advantage of. And that will help us to move towards development that is inclusive. I thank you very much, and I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye. See you soon again, hopefully face to face.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. you.